Today we'll be sewing this top. I'm using House of Akong sweatshirt pattern, but you can use any top pattern you like. I have already cut out my pattern pieces, decided how I want to color block my pattern, and slashed the pattern pieces along the lines of my color blocking. I added 8mm, less than 3/8 of an inch, seam allowances. The seam allowances are added along all my slashed lines. I marked the grain line on each pattern piece and made a notch or notches to mark the points of reference. I also labeled all my pattern pieces. That was my sleeve piece, and of course I did the same thing with the front and the back pieces. It's a simple pattern, and this is simple color blocking. If you make it very intricate, make sure you definitely have the grain line marked on each, even the tiniest piece. If you cut your pieces off grain, they might become wavy and, especially after some time, get misshapen. But my front, back and sleeves are basically going to consist of 2 pieces each. The lines are simple. My sleeve blocks will form a curve rather than a triangle. They look more like they had a sharp point, but when they're sewn, it's far more gentle. And I'm using all the bands from the pattern as they are. No changes here. I'm going to use ribbing for all my bands. My cuffs will be from double fold cuffing. This is very thick, dense cuffing. If your machine struggles with thick layers, it might not be the best idea for you. The fabric I'm using is cotton-based French terry, 250 grams per meter. Always choose fabric that is the same or very similar weight and has the same amount of stretch. All my pattern pieces are cut out of tracing paper that is pretty see-through. That will help me with positioning the pattern pieces on my print. I can see my wales and I can decide where I want them to be on my top. Remember to always follow the grain line. That's the reason why we have the grain line marked on every single pattern piece. So the straight line marked on our pattern pieces is either parallel to the selvage of the fabric, the edge of the fabric that is finished by the manufacturer, or as it is in my case, perpendicular to it. In other words, forming a right angle with it. It's more common for the print to run from selvage to selvage. My print placement is rarer. It's also important to check the stretch of your fabric and use it so that the direction of stretch goes around your body, not up and down. My fabric is 4-way stretch. It stretches about 40% in both directions. But this is not always true for French terry fabric. In fact, many will be 2-way stretch only. I cut my notches with the tip of my scissors. My notches are about 3mm deep, so within my seam allowance. If you are using loose knit or fabric that snags, don't cut notches. Mark them with chalk or your marking tool. By the way, the tracing paper I'm using is free. Ask your friends who work in factories, glass factories or metal factories, what they do with the paper that the sheets of glass or metal are wrapped in. Very often they're either recycled, which the companies pay for, or they're just thrown away. So you might have free tracing paper. As you can see, I'm cutting out on a single layer of fabric, mainly because I want to see my print. But also, if you cut on a single layer, you are saving fabric and you are more accurate. Of course, you can cut things on fold to save time. I'm cutting out on the right side of my fabric for the same reason, so I want to see the print. In this case, it doesn't really matter if I cut on the wrong or on the right side of the fabric, because my pattern pieces would look the same. But follow the instructions. Sometimes you have to cut out on one particular side of the fabric. Usually the wrong side of the fabric, because we can see the grain line better and we can put all the markings there. My sleeves are cut as mirror images, as a pair. So I flipped my pattern piece when I was cutting the other sleeve. I'm going to cut out all the pieces I need in my contrast or plain French terry. This French terry is the same weight, but it has more stretch from selvage to selvage. So my grain line is going to be parallel to the selvage. And of course I placed my pattern pieces with the written side up on the right side of the fabric, because we are not changing it within one pattern. I mean, we can't cut out some pattern pieces right side up and some pattern pieces wrong side up. All my pattern pieces are going to be front in 2 parts, printed and contrast, then back in 2 parts, printed and contrast, then a pair of sleeves, each made up of 2 parts, printed and contrast. But because I want pockets, I'm also cutting out a lining piece that is identical to my lower front pattern piece, and I'm going to cut it out from any leftover fabric that I've got. So I'm cutting it out as last. And at the moment I'm still cutting out my sleeves. That's the bottom part of my sleeves. I know that the point looks a bit sharp, but it's not very sharp. It's more like a bend than a corner. Of course you can have sharp points in color blocking, I just don't want to. Okay, so I have enough of my printed fabric left to cut out my pocket lining. I'm using my lower front pattern piece for that. I actually cut it out placing the pattern piece so that the grain line is parallel to the selvage. The print is now vertical, but my pocket lining is hidden, so I don't mind. I can only do it because this is a 4-way stretch fabric. This reduces waste, and I hate wasting fabric, especially good quality fabric. You might notice that my offcuts at the bottom are just a millimeter or so wide. The lining for the pocket is ready. I'm going to cut out the bottom band, the neckline and the cuffs. That's out of ribbing. I also need some ribbing for the trims on the pocket openings, but I'll see if I have any leftover ribbing. If not, I'll cut it out of any ribbing piece. If you're using cuffing like this one, be very precise cutting it. If your edges are not cut straight, you might struggle with matching the stripes. My cuffs are going to be slightly wider or taller than the button piece, but it doesn't bother me. That's a folded cuff, so it's going to be folded in half. I still haven't got my pockets, so I need to cut them out. I'm taking the front pattern piece and I am only going to use the bottom pattern piece. I'm going to cut my pocket openings there. I've made quite a few videos about pockets like these, so you can watch the videos if something is not clear, but basically you decide how big the opening is going to be, remembering that you need to fit your hand there, and you are cutting it out, leaving enough space from the bottom for the pocket to be deep enough, because if it's straight from the bottom, everything that you put in your pockets is going to fall out. For me, the minimum is 5 centimeters from the bottom or 2 inches from the bottom. That's the shallowest pocket that I think works. I'm going to finish the pockets or the pocket openings with ribbing, and I haven't got any ribbing left, so I need to cut some out. But this is going to be the front, so the top of the front and the bottom with the pockets. Of course, I have the lining for the pocket as well, which means that the bottom part of the front is going to be 2 layers. The lining, the bottom part with the pockets cut out, is attached to the top of the front. I hope it makes sense. If not, this process is shown in my other videos about pockets, so you can watch them. So the lining part, the bottom part that is my lining, the wales, goes underneath with the pretty side facing, so the right side of the lining to the wrong side of the blue fabric, and they're both going to be attached to the top part of the front. And I need to cut out 2 inches wide strip of ribbing to finish my pocket openings. This is going to be my trim, and 1 is going to be enough. I only need 1. I don't cut this trim to size, so I don't need to measure the openings and then cut the trim. I attach the trim, then cut it to the size of the pocket. And I can make scrunchies out of the offcuts. I can finally start sewing. I'm going to attach the trim first to both openings of my pockets. As usual, I am using my overlocker to construct my stretch garment, but you can use your regular sewing machine with a stretch stitch. I'm placing the ribbing on top of the opening, not really pulling, just attaching the ribbing to the opening and then cutting the excess after it's sewn on top of my opening. And I'm repeating that for the other side as well. So I'm finishing the other pocket opening on the other side in the same way. I'm not easing my opening in the ribbing, but if you made an opening that is too big, you can do it. So you can pull on the ribbing and it will make the opening smaller. But it's a different look and that's not what I wanted. This ribbing is going to be top stitched, so I'm using my cover stitch to top stitch it down. But while I'm at the overlocker, I'm also going to attach my lining and my bottom part to the top part. And that will be the front of my jumper, nearly done. I'm sewing through 3 layers of fabric. The top part of my front and 2 bottom parts. One, the lining of the pocket, and the other, the color blocked or the blue bottom part of the front. My edges curl a bit, so I need to be careful there. But other than that, there is nothing difficult here. Just matching the notches and sewing a straight line. But now you can see how the pockets are going to look like. Before I change the machine, I'm going to do as much as possible, as much as I can on the overlocker. So I'm sewing together the other parts of my color blocked top. This one is the back, so I'm attaching the bottom to the top part of my back pattern piece. Again, it's a nice straight seam, so just matching the notches, making sure that the edges of my fabric are together and sewing. And now I'm going to do the sleeves, so I'm attaching the bottom to the top part of the sleeve. And in here I've got this curve, so I'm going to stop in the middle. I've got my clip here, and I'm going to cut a small notch to help me make it a bit straighter, the line of my sewing to be straighter. This is not a sharp corner, I'm not folding too much, I'm just trying to keep my curve as a curve. If I was trying to sew a corner, I would have to fold it more, so the corner would be sharp, but I don't have a sharp corner. And I'm going to do it to the other sleeve as well. So that's the second sleeve, the same thing. I'm stopping in the middle to cut small notches in both the top and the bottom layer of my fabric. And I'm moving my fabric slightly to form a more distinctive curve, but not a corner. And then carrying on, sewing a straight line to the bottom. And the sleeves are also color blocked now. I'm going to top stitch everything later, so all my color blocking is going to be top stitched. But now I'm going to sew together my neckband, my bottom band, so I'm forming a loop in each band. And finally my cuffs, and with my cuffs I need to be very careful. I need to match the stripes in the seam allowance, so not just at the edge, but in the seam allowance all the stripes must be matching. And, well, yeah, they are. Sorry, you can't see very much. And the other cuff in the same way, so matching the stripes in the seam allowance and sewing. Well, finally, I can change my machines and, well, I'm going to use my cover stitch. I'm checking if my cover stitching works for this fabric and if it is to my taste. And I like it, so I'm going to use this thread and the settings of the machine to top stitch, cover stitch from the top, all my color blocked pattern pieces. I'm using top and bottom cover, but of course you can use either 2 or 3 needles cover, or you can use reverse cover stitching if your machine doesn't have the top looper that is called a spreader. Or if you don't have, or if you don't want to use a cover stitch machine, of course you can top stitch using your regular sewing machine. You can use a zigzag or you can use a stretch stitch of your choice. Plenty of decorative stitches are actually stretch stitches, so you can use these. Although if you watch my videos, you know that I use cover stitch a lot, and my videos are mainly about cover stitching. Okay, so, well, I'm cover stitching the sleeves, that's my second sleeve, and as always, we need to remember that the seam allowances are facing down, so towards the needles. The needles are going through all the seam allowances. That makes them flat and gives the garment a more professional look. When you are cover stitching curves, go slowly, be very careful, and always control your fabric. So guide your fabric, don't pull, don't push, but guide your fabric. Now the back of the sweatshirt, and I'm using my foot as a guide. My seam allowances here are directed towards my right hand. So I'm top stitching over the seam allowances on the blue fabric, on the plain blue fabric. And this is a straight line, so it's not very difficult. I'm just checking all the time if my seam allowances are definitely not twisted and are going in the right direction. And the back is nearly done. Remember that you will have to press everything. So as you will probably see, yes, you can see that the stitches are still a bit tight and wavy. They will look much better when they are pressed. And now I'm top stitching the ribbing on the ends of the pockets, on the openings of the pockets. And my files got corrupted, so the image is not great, sorry. But I'm just basically doing the same thing. So my seam allowances are now towards my left hand, and I'm top stitching over all the layers. And this is just my lower front. I'm not top stitching my lining, my pocket lining. So I'm only using the top layer of my garment. Only the pocket openings with the ribbing attached. I'm top stitching the ribbing and the opening of the pocket, the seam allowance between them. The seam allowance is towards my left hand, and it's done. An important thing, I haven't started from the very beginning in any of the cases. As in here, you can see that I'm putting all my fabric under the foot, so the fabric is flat under the foot to the end of the foot, because my machine or any other cover stitch machine won't start otherwise. You will eat your fabric. So if you want to start from the very, very beginning, you can just use a starter piece. So you can use a piece of fabric, start on this piece of fabric, and then carry on your garment. But for me here, it doesn't really matter. The 1 millimeter that is not covered doesn't matter because it's within my seam allowance and my pattern pieces are still not constructed, so it's not a sweatshirt. This is the front, obviously, and it looks like that. So the front is totally covered now. That's the back of the front, the wrong side of the front. You told me off for moving my fabric and my garment too quickly, so I am going to try and be very, very slow in showing you how it looks like, but I find it very difficult to be very slow. That's the stitches. Hopefully you can see that. And now I need to construct the sweatshirt, so I'm changing the machine and I'm going to use my overlocker again because, as I said, I am constructing everything that is stretchy on my overlocker. I have first sewn the shoulder seams and then the side seams. Unfortunately, I've lost the footage of it, so you just have to believe me. But we sew the shoulder seams, then the side seams, either with the sleeves, or if you, like me, prefer to set the sleeves in, you sew the side seams of the bodice and side seams of each sleeve and then set the sleeves in. But now I'm sewing the band, the bottom band to the hem of my top. And this is a bit more tricky because, first of all, it's a long surface, so I need to control my fabric a bit more. And I've got 4 layers of fabric. My ribbing that is folded, and my front that consists of 2 layers. The lining of my pocket and the front itself. I have divided my band, my ribbing, in half and matched the halves with the side seams of my sweatshirt. But I'm constantly making sure that everything is stretched as much as I want, not more, not less. So I'm dividing everything in sections as I sew. There is no point rushing. You can always stop and check and stop and check. And when you get more practice and when you get more confident, it's going to be natural and you will never make mistakes this way. It's almost like muscle memory. Your hands will remember how much to stretch depending on the fabric. So whatever fabric you have, you will learn to control it in the way that you need to control it. That's why I'm not a great believer in overusing pins, because I think you rely on pins too much and you will never learn about the fabric, about the stretch, about the give, about the behavior of the fabric under your machine, under your foot. That's why if I want to be super precise, I always baste everything. I don't use pins because they seem to be quicker and they are quicker at first, but they stop you developing your skills. And I'm not sure if any Russian people watch this video, but if you do, that's very, very Russian, isn't it? all my teachers have been either Polish or Russian. Okay, but I'm now attaching the neckband, and again I'm dividing my neckband in halves and matching the halves with the halves of my opening, my neck line, stretching it to be perfectly flat and sewing in sections. And that's the last thing I'm going to do on the overlocker. And now I'm going to change the machine and I'm going to top stitch all the bands, and the sweatshirt is going to be ready. So I'm top stitching the bottom band. Again, seam allowances are under my needles. So in this case, they are towards my left hand, and I'm top stitching using the cover stitch over all the layers. So over my top layer and over the seam allowances. When I'm top stitching the front, I'm actually top stitching my seam allowances and 2 layers of fabric, because I've got the pocket there and my pocket has a lining. But everything else is pretty simple. Sometimes I need to neaten my project, so I need to cut a few tails. But other than that, it's a simple top stitching on the cover stitch. And I'm not using top and bottom cover because I think it's a bit too much. So I'm just using 3 needle cover stitch in this case. But this is a question of choice, so you do what you want. And the bottom band is nearly ready, nearly finished. I'm usually overlapping 1 or 2 stitches just because I got used to that, but you don't have to. It depends what you prefer. Looks like that. So it's okay, there are no problems here. And I need to do the same to my neckband. And I'm starting at the back just because, well, the first and the last stitch are not the most beautiful, or might not be the most beautiful, so we want them to be at the back. Again, I'm top stitching over the seam allowances. My seam allowances are to the left in this case, and when I come to the intersection, I'm moving the fabric slightly, so I'm making sure that it's straight under the foot, because the foot can move the fabric when it goes through a thicker layer. It's only a millimeter, well, it's less than a millimeter, but if your hand can help it be perfectly straight, why not? And our color-blocked sweatshirt is ready. We can wear it. Well, it's not for me, but Hedge Hubby can wear it now. I'm going to show you the stitches very slowly, and I'm going to show you how I overlap the stitches, and I really don't think it shows in any way, so you don't really have a bump or anything. That's my overlapped stitches, hardly noticeable. And of course, this top was made by my cat, Ulysses.